So dear beloved community, it's such a delight to have a chance to sit together, to be together with the Sangha. And I'm reminded of that line in our chant, sitting here in this moment surrounded by the Sangha, my happiness is pure and alive. Why don't we begin our evening together in the same way that we begin most of our evenings together, with a few minutes of sitting meditation. This coming week, we're going to be practicing together with becoming aware of our sense doors and the nutriment of sense impressions. So I'd like to suggest that we have a very simple guided meditation that members of the Compassionate Ocean Sangha have practiced a few times already, of becoming grounded in this moment through our experience, our embodied experience of our senses. So I'd like to invite you to take a moment to find yourself in your meditation posture, establishing a firm foundation, and then perhaps rocking your body from side to side and inviting your vertebrae to rest one on top of the other, and rolling your shoulders back slightly to open your heart space, resting your hands in your lap. Then perhaps gently closing your eyes, and if you find it helpful, you can imagine a string from the crown of your head attached to the ceiling, just pulling the back of your head up slightly. And then finally, take a moment to do a body scan and just invite a sense of openness and ease and relaxation, a sense of having nowhere else to go and nothing to do, of being at your final destination right here and right now. And as you naturally breathe in, bring a gentle attention to your in-breath, just as it is. And as you breathe out, bring a gentle attention to your out-breath, just as it is. And allowing your awareness of your in-breath to recede slightly, I invite you to bring your attention to the points of contact that you notice in your body, the sensations that are present for you in your body at this moment. Perhaps beginning with the area in your body in which you're noticing the strongest sensation at this moment in time. And that might be where your buttocks is resting on the cushion, or perhaps your two knees on the mat, or your 2 feet on the floor. Perhaps your back is resting against the back of a chair. Just taking a moment to notice those strong sensations in your body, and notice if you're drawn to some areas or you find some aversion to other areas. Engaging a sense of curiosity and interest. Then perhaps allowing your attention to flow through your body and notice other points of contact in your body. Perhaps your two hands resting in each other. Perhaps the sensation of clothes on your skin. Perhaps the different temperatures on your skin at this moment in time. When you notice a sensation, take a moment to notice if it stays the same or if it changes. And slowly and gently returning your attention to the natural sensation of your in-breath and out-breath, wherever you notice it most in your body. And without changing your breath in any way, as you breathe in, just noting to yourself in. And as you breathe out, just noting to yourself out. And then slowly inviting your awareness of your breath to become a little more subtle, just allowing it to sink into the background. I invite you to bring your attention to the sounds that make themselves known to you in this moment. The loud sounds, the soft sounds, the almost silent sounds. Just becoming aware of the entire kaleidoscope of sound present for you in this moment, and noticing if you're drawn towards some or you find some aversion towards others. Just engaging a sense of interest and curiosity to sound. And then noticing if sounds remain the same or if they're constantly changing. Then gently and slowly, allowing our awareness of sound to sink into the background, let's bring our attention back to our natural in-breath and out-breath, just as it is. Breathing in, this is an in-breath. Breathing out, this is an out-breath. And as we continue to breathe, let's bring awareness to the fragrances that make themselves known to us in this moment. The fragrances and odors. Maybe the smell of incense. Perhaps we just finished a meal and there's a lingering aroma of the food we ate. We might be able to smell some fresh flowers that are in the room. Noticing the most predominant fragrance or aroma, and then noticing if it stays the same or it changes. And also noticing if other fragrances or odors come and go, and if we're drawn towards some and find them pleasant, or we find others unpleasant. Just engaging a sense of curiosity and interest. And then gently returning our attention just to our in-breath and out-breath, and letting go of our awareness of fragrance and odor. This is my in-breath just as it is. This is my out-breath just as it is. Dear beloved community, it is such a joy to have an opportunity to practice together with everybody again this evening. Today is the 14th of June in the year 2020. And I hope that at the moment you listen to this talk, that you're experiencing ease and wellness and safety in body and mind. And I'd like to begin this talk by acknowledging that the land that I'm sitting on is part of the Darug nation. And the Darug people are the traditional owners and custodians of this land. And I'd like to pay my respect and gratitude to all of our elders and traditional owners, past and present, who've made this land available for so many generations. So dear family, let's begin with a check-in. I'd like to ask whether through the past week you've been doing the mindful eating exercises. I wonder whether you discovered what it was like to taste a morsel of food fully, what experiences and emotions and thoughts arose as food was digested. And what did you discover about the sources of your food? Did you discover anything interesting as you explored exercises such as putting down your spoon in between each mouthful, or even something as intriguing as following the movement of your tongue, something that we rarely do during eating meditation? This exploration is rich and deep and ongoing. The second aspect of nutriment that we're going to be exploring this week, in the second week of our ongoing at-home retreat, is the more subtle realm of sense impressions. I think that our bodies are great teachers, perhaps some of the greatest we'll ever find. If I ask you to point to yourself, most of you will probably point somewhere in the general vicinity of your heart. On an intuitive level, we don't associate our brain with ourselves. And understanding this is incredibly helpful for us as meditation practitioners. As meditators, we want to cultivate the energy of alert and relaxed attention, which we call mindfulness. Yet many of us subtly equate mind with a kind of intelligence and intellectual awareness that is somehow above our ears. We spend most of our lives, let's tell it like it is, living above our ears. And yet somehow, when we're invited to point to ourselves, we don't point here. We point to the core of our being, to here. As meditation practitioners, we want to infuse the quality of mindfulness throughout our whole being and throughout our whole experience. We want to bring the full-bodied awareness of mindfulness to each moment of our daily lives, including our steps, our breath, the food we eat, and the things we experience through our sense doors. I truly believe that one of the biggest misunderstandings of the spiritual life is the view that spiritual practice is somehow a practice of transcendence, of rising above. This misunderstanding is so deep that it's almost archetypal. Speaking about rising above, at the moment, there's so many things that are happening in our world, so many things that are coming to our attention. So many painful things are arising within families, within communities, and within nations. A lot of the hidden suffering is coming to light. There are some very difficult conversations, difficult things that we're looking into individually and collectively. Particularly around issues of race and discrimination. One thing I've noticed over the past few weeks is that there are times when we're having conversations with others, or it might be online, people are discussing about an issue, and somebody will raise up an issue, and then at a certain point, the person will just say, I'm bowing out of this conversation, or, I'll leave it to you to discuss, or no, I'm feeling uncomfortable, I'm going to go and do something else. And I've really been looking at this tendency. It tends to happen among those of us who find ourselves in the majority. When we feel uncomfortable, we bow out of the conversation. People of color, minorities such as the LGBTQIA community and other minorities don't have the luxury to bow out of the conversation. Each and every day, each and every moment, this is the reality. Actually, all of us have privilege, and we need to see it for what it is on all levels. And I've come to see, perhaps incompletely, that our tendency to raise an issue and to bow out of the conversation when we're feeling even slightly uncomfortable is a concrete manifestation of our privilege. As practitioners, and moreover as students of Te, I feel that the invitation of our teacher Te is to stay in the room, both in terms of social change, but also with each thing that arises. I also believe that this is the invitation of the Buddha as well, to stay with the thing that challenges us, the thing that broadens our horizons, the thing that calls us forth. Staying in the room, staying in the conversation when we're uncomfortable, when we're challenged, is where the real work happens on all levels. For our meditation practice to be an experience of true transformation and not just a subtle form of spiritual bypassing or a pretend transcendence of suffering, we need to have the courage to bring all parts of ourselves to the table and to stay in the room. And don't be fooled for a second. This takes a lot of courage, a lot. Especially since many of us have been conditioned to think of holiness in terms of floating on white clouds and playing angels' harps rather than true wholeness, which means including everything. If we speak of wholeness, it means including everything, becoming whole. And within this construct, to choose to be a real human being is a radical act of acceptance indeed. Why don't we enjoy a sound of the bell? Today we enjoyed walking meditation with some friends in the forest, in the bush behind Mountain Spring. It was absolutely beautiful down there today. Last night, we had a lot of rain that fell, and so today there was a freshness, a beauty down there. Such green and aliveness was present everywhere. And as I was walking in the forest with friends, I was surrounded by the fragrance of eucalyptus and the sounds of birds. As we sat on the moss-covered rocks in the Ancestors' Grove, which is a very beautiful and ancient part of the forest behind Mountain Spring, I opened my ears and my eyes and my nose and my whole body to the experience. Experiencing it with all my different senses, becoming sensate. Very simply, sense impressions are the responses that we have to objects that we see with our eyes, that we hear with our ears, that we smell with our nose, that we taste with our tongues, and that we touch with our bodies. For those of you who are astute, you will recognize that in the guided meditation that we just did, I did not include taste and sight, partially for time reasons. I love that meditation so much that we could continue on for an hour, but I thought I better have a little time for a Dharma talk. But I invite you to do that at home through this week. In fact, whenever we practice stopping this week, dropping into our senses is a powerful way to practice stopping, to come fully to life. So of course, sense impressions can be much more subtle than just the responses that we have to objects we see with our eyes, ears, nose, and tongue, and so on. But for those of us who are beginners, we might find that as a helpful orientation to the general realm of sense impressions. Sense impression, the second form of nutriment, is a translation of the Pali word phasahara, which literally means the food of sense contact, with phasa as the root, which means, phasa means touch or contact. By touch here, we mean the touch or contact between what we call a sense base in Buddhist psychology, which is basically the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind, and a sense object. For example, for the sense base ears, the sense object is sound. For the sense base tongue, the sense object is taste. For the sense-based mind, the sense object is thought, and so on. So, in addition, there's a consciousness associated with each of these sense bases. For example, the eyes have a kind of consciousness in Buddhist psychology that we call eye consciousness. And then I wonder if you can guess what the consciousness associated with ears are. It's very complicated. That's right, it's ear consciousness, and so on. Now, if you want to get really technical, and I know some of you do, then in Buddhist psychology, we refer collectively to the 6 sense bases, the 6 sense organs, the 6 sense objects, and the 6 consciousness as the 18 realms of being, or in the Heart Sutra, the new translation of the Heart Sutra, that our teacher, Thay, offered, we call it the 18 realms of phenomena. That's what the 18 realms of phenomena are. The 6 sense bases, our eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And then the objects that those bases and their consciousness are in search of. Collectively, 3 6s are 18. So the 18 realms of being, the 18 different ways in which we experience the world. Since our sense bases each have a form of consciousness associated with them, each object that is perceivable to a corresponding kind of consciousness would normally trigger a response in a similar manner as to when one hand raises up and the other hand joins together with it to make a clapping sound. That's how it kind of works. Our consciousness is there, a stimulus occurs, and then there's a contact. There are quite a few ways to understand this metaphor. Let's take the example of a smell, for example. Imagine you're sitting on the sofa, on the lounge in your living room, in your lounge room. Resting on the table in the kitchen is a freshly baked apple pie, still warm from the oven. By the way, there are a lot of apples, apple pie, and apple juice in Bilpin, where Mountain Spring Monastery is. It's known as the land of the mountain apple. So this is something that we experience every day. In fact, one of our dear friends, one of the local villagers, stopped by today and gave us a large bottle of freshly squeezed apple juice. It was absolutely delicious. So apples are very much part of our existence here in Bilpin. So this is something that's very present for me. So imagine you have that apple pie in your kitchen. Every now and again, the fragrance of the apple pie reaches your nostrils and is strong enough for you to consciously register it. Most of the contacts between sense objects and our sense bases, they're on a very subtle level and we don't necessarily register them. So imagine that the fragrance of the apple pie is strong enough that it registers for us. And so to use the metaphor, this is the first hand rising up. And this is the first clap, but it's not the only clap that occurs. It's not the only sound that occurs, the only connection that occurs. With most sense impressions, we have conscious or unconscious associations with almost every single sense impression. And these associations can be pleasant, they can be painful or unpleasant, or they can be both, kind of mixed. Sometimes we translate it as neutral, but mixed or neither pleasant or painful, or both pleasant and painful at the same time might be more helpful for you. So use whatever phrasing you find helpful there. And many times, in fact, what we react to are our unconscious associations rather than the bare experience of the sense impression itself. It's really important in when we're looking at the realm of sense impressions to understand this distinction. The second clap, or sometimes Tay refers to it as the second arrow. And we've heard Tay speak about this many times. Our unconscious associations. Perhaps for some of us, the fragrance of the apple pie is very pleasant. It's absolutely delightful. For others of us, it might give rise to unpleasant associations. Yesterday, we went to visit. We walked about half a kilometer down the road to where there's a weekly market of all of the local people who are making their different products. Some people are making jams and some people are making little cakes, or there's a baker there who grinds his own flour and makes his own bread. There's a farmer there who has beautifully fresh vegetables and so on. There was a stall that there was a gentleman who makes his own essential oils, and I had to smile because we have a dear friend near our monastery in California, near Deer Park Monastery, who also makes his own essential oils, and his wife posted up a picture of him making essential oils and said, "Real men distill their own lavender oil." So I was thinking of our friend yesterday when we were at the essential oil stand. And we were there with some friends who had come to visit us for the day. And as we were at the stall, the gentleman was sharing, he makes 5 different oils there. Tea tree oil and kind of a eucalyptus oil and also a lavender oil. And so as we were smelling the lavender oil, one of the friends absolutely refused to smell the lavender oil and said, "Every time I smell lavender oil, I feel very nauseous. I can't stand that smell. I don't know why." So a fragrance that is pleasant for one person, or any kind of sensory impression that is pleasant for one person, may not necessarily be pleasant or enjoyable for other people. Sometimes our unconscious and conscious associations can be quite humorous. Many years ago in Plum Village, we had an elder brother whose responsibility in the Sangha was to correct the other monks' postures during sitting meditation. There was a time in Plum Village where our teacher, Tay, really wanted to emphasize the importance of posture. And so if you go to Plum Village, actually, you'll see in some of the meditation halls, in the transformation hall, for example, there's a mirror there. So Tay, when I was a young monk, Tay was teaching us and suggesting to us that we would go and we would sit meditation and sit in front of the mirror. And then at a certain point, we would open our eyes and see if we're sitting upright or if we'd slumped to the side or not. So during that period, we had one elder brother, Tevongai, whose responsibility was to, during sitting meditation, he would walk very slowly around the meditation hall. And if one of the monks' postures was not upright, if it was not balanced, his job was to bow to that brother and then gently to correct their posture and then to move on. But he had very dry and cracked hands, so he would use Nivea hand cream. He used Nivea hand cream quite often. And as he gently and slowly moved around the meditation hall, the scent of Nivea hand cream would follow him. It would kind of float around the hall with him. And so by the fragrance alone, it can be quite a strong smell, the Nivea hand cream. By the fragrance alone, we would know exactly where he was in the meditation hall, and we'd make sure our posture was correct whenever the Nivea hand cream scent would approach. So to this day, whenever I smell Nivea hand cream, I remember my brother. For me, it's not an unpleasant memory. It's not necessarily an extremely pleasant one, but it's just one of those scent memories that I have. Speaking of meditation halls, during sitting meditation, we often burn a stick of incense. We light a stick of incense. In fact, in monasteries that don't have a bell or don't have a clock, the length of a sitting meditation period is determined by the length of the stick of incense. You sit for 1 incense stick or 2 incense sticks and so on. Anyway, in the Vietnamese language, we don't actually say, I smell the fragrance of the incense. We say, I listen to or I hear the fragrance of the incense. Isn't that a beautiful way? Tôi nghe mùi. I hear the fragrance. We don't say that in English. We make the distinction between the senses. But isn't that an interesting and beautiful way to experience anew the relationship with one of our sense capacities? What does it mean to you to listen to a fragrance? What does it mean to you to listen to a taste? What does it mean to you to listen to a sensation in your body? During this week, I invite you to explore how you experience your sensory input in these ways, to experience them in a broader sense. Why don't we have a sound of the bell? In fact, we're bombarded by a multitude of sense impressions each and every moment of our daily lives. Since most of them are very subtle, we're only consciously aware of a minuscule amount of them. Sense impressions can nurture and give rise to many things within us. They can feed emotions such as joy, happiness, and peace, emotions such as anger, depression, and jealousy. The realm of sense impressions is quite a bit subtler than those of edible foods. With edible foods, we're dealing with quite concrete objects. Due to their subtlety, sense impressions require a different and slightly more refined quality of attention for us to be fully aware of their impact on us. In recent times, I've noticed many people coming to visit our practice centers who are deeply exhausted, and I've spoken about this before. Upon arrival in the monastery, they're offered an orientation to the basic mindfulness practices, and as part of the introductory session, I always ask our newly arrived friends what moved them to decide to come to the monastery at this moment in time. And again, I hear things like, oh, I feel like I could sleep for 24 hours. I don't even know when I'd be able to get up again. These kind of things are shared really often. But I've also been intrigued to notice that after a day or two in a practice center, some guests will say things like, oh, it's so busy in the monastery. Why is the schedule so full? Or I can't believe it. It's so jam-packed and so on. To be honest, in the monastery, we're not really doing that much at all. In fact, we tend to be quite lazy people. We walk, we sit, we eat, we wash the dishes. That's it. On the surface, there's nothing special. The main difference between the environment of a practice center and the everyday lives of many of us is that in the practice center, we've created an environment in which we can do one thing at a time in a focused and fully attentive way. We're not in an environment where we're bombarding our senses with so much input, whether it is listening to the radio or watching like so much TV or listening to podcasts or all these kind of things. We're choosing to do one thing at a time in a fully focused and fully attentive way. On one level, this is a luxury. We're aware of that. But on another level, I feel that choosing to engage fully with each and every moment of our lives and making choices that nurture this sense of rest and allow us to come home and to inhabit our bodies is an absolute necessity. Returning to the exhaustion that I mentioned earlier, I've begun to believe, maybe incorrectly, that it's not so much the monastery schedule that's exhausting for our friends. I think it's that actually the safe and mindful and slowed down environment of a monastery or a practice center actually gives our friends permission to acknowledge the depths and the layers of accumulated physical and mental exhaustion that we've been carrying. Much of this exhaustion has to do with the sheer volume of sense impressions that our bodies and minds are consciously and unconsciously bombarded with each and every day. We notice here in Mountain Spring Monastery that when people arrive, they're often quite drawn and looking a little tired and perhaps a little bit solemn. So here in the monastery, we don't really, the house that we have is very small. And due to social distancing regulations in Australia, we have to have 4 square meters per person. So since the house that we have at the moment is quite small, we can't really have that many people inside. So we take our friends down to the forest and we practice outside. We have our day of mindfulness as much as possible outside. And we've noticed that each and every time we begin, we have that sense of people being quite tired and still running a little bit with the energy, a little bit buzzy. And then we enjoy, we always welcome people here with a cup of tea and just a gentle tea meditation and a welcoming of everybody to this space to enjoy a cup of tea together with friends, to sit quietly, to really arrive. And we have a short orientation to the day and perhaps a few words about what our practice focus will be for the day. Then we enjoy walking meditation, and we walk down to the forest, and we're underneath the shade of these beautiful trees near waterfalls and amongst the rocks, and we'll have some sitting meditation down there halfway through our walking meditation. Perhaps we'll have a Dharma sharing down in the forest most weeks if it's not too cold. And then we'll have a mindful meal We have a large rock that's overlooking a valley there, and we'll have a mindful meal. And then we'll make our way slowly back to the monastery for our afternoon activities. And we've noticed each and every time that we do this, that being down in the forest without all the mobile phones on, with nothing else happening, but just simply being there for their lived experience, people come to life. And when they come back to the monastery, the little house here at the top of the hill, after spending some time in the forest, people's eyes are brighter. They have so much more energy. People have come home to themselves. And this is really the power of what we call a technological sabbatical, of just coming back home, of being in an environment that supports this kind of awareness, of choosing to have some moments where you inhabit your senses. When you're in the forest, having forest bathing, or simply being in the forest, you come back to your senses. You smell the wet earth, the beautiful eucalyptus, the sounds of the birds. You feel the breeze on your skin. It's just, we have this innate capacity to be able to come fully to life. And that environment nurtures that. And the environment of a practice center or a monastery, Plum Village, or our other monasteries in the Plum Village tradition are designed to support that capacity of coming home. And this is something that we can also do in our own homes as well, even if it's for 5 or 10 minutes or an hour. This is something that's possible, and not only possible, but absolutely necessary. A few months ago, it was probably about 6 months ago now, I went to the doctor in Los Angeles, and as I was entering the building, I noticed a sign pointing to a gift store that said, "Shiny, pretty things this way." And I had to smile a little, because I feel that that sign sums up our current condition. We live in a culture and a mindset of continual distraction. As a result, it's quite challenging for us to simply be present with our experience for any sustained length of time. We've become so habituated to, and in fact, we celebrate doing a multitude of things at once, multitasking, that for many of us, the singular attention that we choose to cultivate in the beginning stages of meditation can almost induce a subtle existential crisis. In some ways, therefore, as meditators, we perform a radical act on a daily basis. Rather than being multitaskers, in the beginning, we practice to become monotaskers, unitaskers, doing one thing at a time. This is exactly the opposite of what we've been trained to do by our society, or what we consider to be successful. If we can do 12 things at once, that's considered to be success. But as meditators, in order to be able to do those 12 things well, we have to train ourselves to be able to do one thing well. And if ever you have practiced to draw your attention to your breath, the simple process of drawing your attention to your breath, you will know how challenging it is to be fully present for simply one thing in the beginning. It's a real training. So if we can't be present for one thing fully in the beginning, is it really actually the case that we're fully present for 12 things? I wonder. As meditators, we train ourselves to focus our attention on a single object, to be able to rest with our breath, with our step, or to pay attention to a sound or a sensation in our body. To do one thing at a time in this day and age is a radical act, and it can also seem like an unimaginable luxury or even naive. Certainly, we each have a multitude of responsibilities in our daily lives. We can, however, make conscious choices to bring mindful and open-hearted attention to different areas of our lives. In this way, over time, there becomes less and less separation between our spiritual life, in inverted commas, and our quote-unquote everyday life. They come a little closer together. Let's have a sound of the bell. Earlier, I mentioned that when there's a stimulus, our consciousness responds. There are a couple of aspects to this. In some sense, there's a universal response. For example, if there's a sound, and assuming that all the necessary factors are there, our ears are in reasonable condition, the sense consciousness associated with ears is doing well enough, and the sound is strong enough that it registers, our consciousness registers it, then we hear it. There's also an aspect of sense impressions that's very unique or particular to each one of us. We each experience things in a slightly different way due to different factors, such as genetic factors, our own personal preferences, our personal histories, our ancestors' histories, and so on. A split second after a sense base, such as our ears, for example, interacts with a sense impression, a subtle or less subtle feeling, a shade of feeling arises. Again, it might be a pleasant feeling, a painful feeling, or a neutral feeling. But it instantaneously colors our sensation. Some sense impressions are very clearly linked with unpleasant feelings. For example, let us imagine that we're in a classroom and somebody comes in the room, there's a blackboard there, and somebody comes in the room, as people used to do when I was going to school, and scrape their fingernails down the blackboard. This was something that some kids found hilarious to do for other kids, and everyone in the room would be, ah! So most of us would be in that situation, having a very particular, visceral, unpleasant reaction to that fingernails down a blackboard. Very few of us enjoy that sound. There are other sounds, tastes, and smells that will give rise to a pleasant feeling. Again, it's very different and subjective for each one of us. However, many of these experiences are so subtle that they impact us below the level of conscious awareness. So many of us don't even notice this process taking place. One very strong association that I've mentioned before in my own life is with the smell of fruitcake. My grandmother was a cake decorator, and so her house was always filled with the smell of fruitcake from the time I was very young to the time I left home. I think I might have fruitcake, the smell of fruitcake embedded in my pores. It was such a strong smell in her house. She made so many of them and had to age them in cabinets in the house. It almost seemed as if the walls were impregnated with the smell of fruitcake. So whenever I smell fruitcake or Christmas plum pudding, I immediately, without any intention at all, I think of my grandmother, and there's a whole set of associations, including memories and feelings that arise with that experience. So it's the same for each one of us with each and every sense impression that we come into contact with, whether we're consciously aware of it or not. And in the beginning, we're only really aware of the big neon sensory impressions, the really big ones. Over time, we'll become more and more sensitive to all of the different, more subtle sense impressions that we're not even noticing. It's a revelation. Each sight, sound, taste, smell, sensation, or thought triggers associations, memories, and feelings. And part of our practice as meditation practitioners is becoming conscious of not only all of these layers of sensory input, but also these associations, memories, and feelings that we have with them, and recognizing that most of the time, what we call reality is heavily colored by these unconscious associations, memories, and feelings, rather than the sensory input itself. A few years ago, one of our monastic sisters had just moved to the United States from Vietnam, and she hadn't met many non-Vietnamese monastics up until that point. And so when she met me, she came right up to me and very close, and she looked in my eyes and said, Brother Pháp Hai, your eyes are green. My eyes are brown. Do you see the same colors I do? And I thought to myself, that's a very good question. The answer is probably not. I probably don't see things exactly the same way that you do. Even if on a certain level we're sharing the same physical space and experience, we probably have different capacities with our sense bases. You may notice certain things that I don't notice, and vice versa. What presents itself to my eye consciousness, to use the example that I just offered, is probably slightly different from what presents itself to your eye consciousness. Is your experience of the color green the same as my experience of the color green? Who knows? We just assume that it is, but who actually knows? We know that similar parts of our brain lights up and so on, but in terms of our actual lived experience of the color green, who knows? When we sit and we discuss our experience of the color green, of this moment, of this meal, or of this sound, it becomes apparent very quickly that while on one level we all experience the same stimulus, each one of us is at the same time having a very unique response. This is one aspect of what's meant by two terms that are used quite commonly in Buddhist psychology, the universal and the particular, which I touched on just a few moments ago. The term universal refers to a broad, generalized experience shared in some way by many. For example, the color green or the taste of a banana. And the particular refers to your individual response to an experience of something. For example, the color green or the taste of a banana. In Buddhist psychology, there's another concept that's essential to understand as we continue our exploration within the realm of sense impressions. That's something called the three modes of cognition. Yes, it's another quite technical term, but please don't be afraid. The three modes of cognition describe the ways that our consciousness interacts with the world, what we call the world, according to Buddhist psychology. And having a basic understanding of these three modes of cognition and becoming aware of which mode of cognition we're operating under in our daily life or in any particular moment can be incredibly helpful. The first mode of cognition is called things in and of themselves. Now, I'm just going to be upfront about this. This type of cognition or direct perception is actually quite rare for most of us. As I type these lines, and I typed them earlier today, just this little paragraph here. I was thinking of a beautiful rose bush that I have outside of my room. We've lived together for the last 3 months. And I might think that since the rose bush and I have lived together for 3 months, that we understand each other pretty well, that I understand it well, or maybe even fully. Now that would be a mistake. My limited perception of the rose bush is filtered through many lenses, or many interpretations, if you like. For example, I might consider the rose as a flower. I might consider it as a plant, or as pink, or lovely, and so on. So all of these labels are correct as far as they go, but they remain firmly within the realm of words and concepts. And words and concepts can never give us a complete picture of something. They can never adequately describe ultimate reality. I'm reminded of the time the Buddha was asked to describe nirvana. So rather than saying what nirvana, what liberation was, which would have given us even more concepts to hold on to. And actually, I think that's what everybody was hoping for. They were hoping for some kind of clarity, hoping for some concepts, because concepts for us in the human realm give us a sense of safety. So, but rather than describing nirvana in terms of concepts, he described nirvana in terms of what nirvana is not. It's not hot. It's not cold. It's not born, and so on. Nirvana is the ultimate extinction of all ideas and concepts. Why don't we stop right here and contemplate for a minute this thought, this sentence. Nirvana is the extinction of all concepts and notions. When we speak of entering nirvana, do we think that nirvana is a location that exists within the realm of time and space? Or do you think that nirvana exists separately from time and space? Or does nirvana transcend these pairs of opposites? Time and space, self and others, living beings and lifespan are all notions and concepts. And whilst concepts and notions are helpful and necessary, they don't give us a complete picture of ultimate reality. If you're hiking in the woods, then knowing which way is north would probably be quite helpful. But we can't use concepts to describe nirvana, which is beyond all notions and concepts. And that's so foreign to our usual way of thinking, that if you stop and contemplate the fact that there's something beyond all notions and concepts, and there are no words, no concepts that can describe it, it is really just a profound experience to sit and to contemplate that. It's actually quite rare for us to simply be with what I call our bare experience. We're usually unconsciously or consciously interpreting, labeling, or telling ourselves stories about our experience. This goes on constantly. It's actually extremely rare and considered to be extremely rare in Buddhist psychology to perceive something like a flower, the beautiful rose bush outside of the room that I'm staying in, for example, an emotion or a sense impression, just as it is, without layers of interpretation. If we do so, it tends to be very brief and unsustained. As we continue to develop the quality of sustained attention that we call mindfulness, our capacity for this quality of attention and awareness and insight deepens and has the right conditions to manifest. Let's have a sound of the bell. Continuing on with the three modes of cognition, the three ways in which we can perceive the world, the second of the three modes of cognition is the mode that's most commonly active in our day-to-day life. It's called the realm of representations. And this is what I was referring to just a moment ago when I mentioned that when we experience a sense impression such as a sight, a sound, or a taste, we tell ourselves a story about it. Or a feeling arises based on a past experience, a notion, or some kind of tendency. To put it very simply, the realm of representations refers to the mode of cognition that arises when our sense bases, our eyes, our ears, and so on, come into contact with a stimulus, and then we interpret that experience subtly or less subtly. It's hot, it's cold, and so on. We're not in contact with the object of our attention just as it is, but rather we're in contact with what that object represents for us, what we tell ourselves about that object. Does that make any sense? If you're a sharp practitioner, and all of us are, then you might be asking yourself at this point, well, Papa, if that's the case, then is there an independent reality existing separately from our mind? Good question. Glad you asked. Let me give you a hint. Our school of Buddhist psychology is called the Vijnanavada school, the mind-only school. but we'll save the discussion of that for a later time. Just a little pointing out instruction right there. Each one of us, when we taste or hear, smell or see something, makes an interpretation on a subtle level. Very often it's primarily that interpretation rather than the object itself that nurtures our happiness and sadness, despair or depression. So it can be extremely helpful, powerful, for us to begin to make an effort to distinguish between the bare experience and our interpretation. Over time, by practicing in this way, what we call reality or the truth becomes just a little bit more porous, a little more expansive. And then the third mode of cognition is called the realm of mere images. Now, these are mental images that are occurring for most of us in our dream state, or when our eyes are closed and an image appears to our mind's eye. It might be a dream, a daydream, or simply the image of a banana. There are a lot of bananas in this talk. For some of us, this realm, this mode of cognition, the realm of mere images, seems to occur a lot during sitting meditation. We often find that those of us who experience strong emotional challenges have as one of their predominant modes of cognition the realm of mere images. These three modes of cognition are the main ways through which we perceive and interact with what we call the world, which, according to Buddhist psychology, is primarily a subjective experience. In the Discourse on the Sun's Flesh, the Puttamansa Sutta, which we're using as a basis for our exploration of the four aspects of nutriment, the Buddha offers another incredibly strong image as a metaphor for sense impressions. He asks us to imagine a cow with no skin and no protection that's being bitten by flying insects. The Buddha then invites us to reflect on our relationship with sense impressions in the same way. This is a very important reflection for us to engage in, particularly if we notice ourselves feeling exhausted or feeling skinless in our daily life. I know some of us do. Where is our attention being drawn in daily life? What physical environments do we experience in the course of a day? What sounds do we hear? What tastes do we seek out? What do we find ourselves looking at? What media are we feeding ourselves with? What responses, both subtle and overt, do we have to these stimuli? If we begin to pay attention to these sense impressions as nutriment, then we begin to notice that certain sense impressions give rise to certain responses. In the beginning stages of establishing our mindfulness solidly, it's essential to create a nurturing and supportive environment around ourselves, as I shared earlier with the environment of a practice center, an environment around ourselves that nurtures the kinds of qualities we want to see in our lives and around us. This practice is traditionally called shutting the sense doors. We need to do this because in the beginning stages of our practice, it's very easy for us to become overwhelmed and swept away by sense impressions. So putting ourselves in a nurturing environment, consciously choosing not to engage with so many sense impressions is a very important practice in the beginning, so that we can become cognizant of all of these layers of responses that we have going on in any moment. Due to our various circumstances and responsibilities, it might not be possible for shutting the sense doors to be a 24-hour experience. Perhaps it might only be possible for us to have the doors closed for an hour a day. But this hour a day will begin to influence our entire day. We will feel a relief immediately by making choices to nurture ourselves. So I invite you to create an environment around yourself that supports you. And this does mean making some choices. it should not mean cutting ourselves off from life, if that were even possible. It may mean looking deeply at what we do when we're tired or we're overwhelmed. Do we automatically just reach for a mobile device or reach for the television remote or something like that? Does that really create a sense of rest? Do we flip on the TV to watch the latest reality show? Now, I personally don't feel I need to keep up with the Kardashians. I have enough challenge keeping up with or showing up for myself, let alone keeping up with the Kardashians or all these other things. I don't know how I would find time to watch television. There's so much going on with my own mind, and it's more interesting than any reality show anywhere. Maybe I'm the only one. That's always possible. As the quality of mindfulness establishes itself more firmly within us and manifests on a more conscious basis, we're able to maintain this awareness in various circumstances. You know, there's an old saying from the Chinese tradition that sums up this process beautifully. It says, a minor hermit, a small hermit, needs to reside in the mountains, but a major hermit, the real hermit, lives right in the heart of the marketplace. So we need to be careful that we don't begin to see our spiritual practice as something that's in conflict with daily life. Rather, it's our daily life itself. Understanding the impact of sense impressions and consciously practicing to close our sense doors to protect ourselves is essential. But meditation is not about closing ourselves off from life. Rather, once our mindfulness is firmly established, we can bring the open-hearted quality of mindfulness to engage with each moment of our life just as it is. And this is engaged practice. If we're not careful to avoid nurturing a rigid state of mind, over time, that there's the possibility that we could, in choosing to close our sense doors and things, if we don't engage that sense of open-hearted mindfulness, we can become increasingly reactive to our environment. Rather than opening up, we begin to close down. So in terms of choosing to close our sense doors, of choosing to understand fully how we interact with our sense bases, one of the most important things that we can experiment with is to engage with what I call a technological sabbatical. And I mentioned it earlier in the context of a practice center. The sabbatical can be 1 minute long, an hour long, or a day long. In fact, in one place that I've had the chance to offer some retreats at Rancho La Puerta, when you arrive, they give everybody a cell phone sleeping bag to put your mobile phone in the sleeping bag for the time that you're at Rancho La Puerta. And it's beautiful to see everybody just put their mobile devices in the sleeping bag and put it in the drawer and then just engage with life. I invite you to consider this week turning off your mobile devices for a minute, an hour, or a whole day if you're brave. You'll be okay, and the world will be okay as well. It's become such a habitual response to check our phone when we hear the notification chime. We just have to know what the message is. In fact, if the chime goes off and we don't reach for it right away, our anxiety level rises and rises and rises and rises. It can be quite interesting to experiment with how long we leave it until we just have to see what it is. Of course, there are times that we need to be available, but I wonder whether we need to be available 24/7, 365, or whether it might be possible for us to choose to take an hour, to choose to take a day in which we put some time aside and not be pulled in 100 directions at once. When we're in between things, perhaps we're standing in a checkout line, or we might be waiting for something in the doctor's waiting office. Then we are, so many of us pull out our phones just to have something to do. it's becoming increasingly challenging just to sit and to do nothing. Having nothing to do doesn't need to be a torture. It can actually be a delight. There's never been a time when we've been more connected and yet paradoxically, in some cases, more disconnected from each other and from our own experience. And a technological sabbatical can be one way to slow down the amount of sensory input, or as I like to put it, the amount of shiny, pretty things that we get pulled into on a moment-by-moment basis. And I invite you to consider in what way a technological sabbatical might make sense for you at certain periods through this week, to experiment with it a little. So as a few exercises for this week, as a general exercise, I'd like to invite you to regularly bring your attention to the things that you're hearing, seeing, smelling, sensing, tasting. And as you become more comfortable with that, perhaps every time you practice stopping with the sound of the bell, dropping into one of your senses, becoming more comfortable with that exercise, then take it to the next level and notice what feelings emerge as you're coming into contact with a stimulus, in contact with different sounds, what different shades of feeling emerge, smells and tastes and so on. What shades of feeling emerge? And at the end of the day, you might want to take a few moments to reflect on the sense impressions that were particularly strong for you. This might have been certain sounds or smells or physical sensations that stood out. And what were the strongest sense impressions that you experienced today? And what's your relationship with them in this moment? And perhaps each day, try to bring a little more attention to one or another of your senses. Perhaps today you focus more on what you hear and your responses to sound. And then tomorrow on what you taste and your responses to taste. And the next day on what you smell and so on. And slowly begin to notice the more subtle sense impressions. And as you do this through the week, you'll begin to notice the subtle reactions and responses that you have to those sense impressions. This can be a very informative and instructive practice. You might also notice as you go through the week that one or another of your sense doors is your predominant sense. And I think you might discover that for some of us, we are auditory and our ears are our predominant sense, or for some of us it's smell, for some of us it's taste, or others of us are kinesthetic. It's our body and so on. And for some of us, it's our thoughts, it's our mind, our mind consciousness. That's the predominant sense. So it can be interesting as you reflect on the sense impressions, at the end of the day, reflecting on the sense impressions that were strongest for you. As you come towards the end of this week's practice, just have a look back and see if the sense impressions that were strongest for you over the course of a week tend to be predominantly in one or another of the sense realms. You might discover something interesting. So one final reflection or practice this week that could be helpful to consider is, along with the shades of feeling, what are the stories, or what are some of the stories or interpretations that you tell yourself about your experiences? For example, if you notice a fragrance, a smell that you find very pleasant, why do you find that pleasant? Or why is it unpleasant, and so on. In this way, it'll be a transformative exploration. I wish you every good luck with this week's practice. Through this week, from time to time through the week, I'll post up these reflection questions one by one and these exercises in the Facebook group for the Compassionate Ocean Sangha, so that if we haven't had a chance to jot these down, then it'll be easy to follow along and to just enjoy them at your own pace. We'll end with the sound of the bell, and then we'll have a couple of public service announcements. So let's find ourselves back in our bodies, just coming back to our breath, and enjoy 3 sounds of the bell.